Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to our unit on Nordic mythology, Norse culture, and all things Scandinavian. So for today's lesson or today's video, what we're going to basically cover is Beowulf. And no, we're not going to cover the entirety of Beowulf. We're going to read three specific sections from Beowulf, namely the combat with the various monsters that he faces. And we're going to answer some close reading questions. We're going to analyze some of the significance of those particular passages and just get a gist of this piece of literature overall for our humanities class. Now, Beowulf is technically an epic poem. I personally have found professors and authors that don't want to call it an epic, but it has a lot of the tropes of an epic poem. And it's actually our very oldest, it's one of the oldest, I think it is the oldest piece of technically English literature that we have. However, as you're going to see in a minute, it's not technically English. It is a properly understood Old English text. So really quick history on Beowulf. It is a narrative poem, so it is just a long poem of over 1,000 lines telling a story of this man called Beowulf. Now, it's written, as you see, somewhere between 700 and 1000 AD, so it is a medieval poem, right? We are transitioning officially now away from ancient Rome, the Roman Empire, into the medieval ages proper. Now, excuse me. Now, it is, as it says, the oldest piece of English writing we have today. And so as a result of that, it's become extremely popular as a piece of historical study, as a piece of an artifact that we could study from these long gone ages of the English culture, because we have a lot of materials when it comes to the classical world. So Rome, Egypt, Greece, these cultures we have a lot of materials from. There's less clear-cut cultural artifacts that we have from the English world. Now, the interesting thing about this particular work of Beowulf is that its style in making, as it says here, mirrors that of the Greek myth by using both, or by kind of fusing both historical elements as well as fantastical elements as well. So, for instance, do we know that there were people called Geats? Yes. Do we know that there were kings, a king called Hrothgar? Yeah, absolutely. Do we know that the places and settings of this particular story did exist sometime under the names that are given here? Yes, there absolutely were. However, are there demons? Are there dragons? All this kind of stuff? No, I'm afraid not, unless, a radical supernatural discovery occurs soon. No, those are the mythic elements. Those are the fantastical elements. So you can see, just like how we saw with the Greek myths, that we are using a modern day, I'm sorry, not a modern day, but a non-fictional, real present setting, but we are infusing it with fantastical elements and people. So a note on the language here. I usually pull this slide up when I begin teaching Shakespeare every year, and you'll see it again for sure when we teach Shakespeare in 9th grade. Beowulf is written in Old English, okay? Now, I've taken a kind of rough Old English phrase here, or sequence of phrases from the movie Beowulf, because there are instances in that movie where certain characters do speak in Old English. And that's Anglo-Saxon, is another way to understand that. So when we see the phrase Old English, this is really what we should think of, right? And I'm not going to, butcher the pronunciation here, but you can kind of see as you're looking at this particular, series of lines. For example, this one right here, "Her was swastrongar," swastrongar. We can kind of see the cognates there in the word strong, right? Her ripper orphan min armen, right? He ripped off mine arm, or my arm, right? So we see the roots of those good old Anglo-Saxon monosyllabic words from our language in here. So why do I usually joke about this in Shakespeare? Because, of course, a lot of teachers, a lot of students, mistakenly say, oh, Shakespeare is written in that Old English, okay? They mean older English, ladies and gents, but if you want to be nitpicky and nerdy about it and, fix your glasses and say, actually, old English looks like that, sounds like that. We could barely understand it. Later on in the medieval era that we're going to read from in the next unit right after this video, we see Middle English, right? So a lot of our medieval texts like Chaucer, and this kind of stuff would be written and spoken in this much more Middle English text, where it's a little bit more understandable, right? He was so strong, so it's a little bit more recognizable. Hail ripped off the arm. Again, a little bit different, but it's definitely easy to understand. The actual term for what Shakespeare writes in, of course, is early modern English. So there's a cool little lesson of how the English language is going to progressively get more and more familiar to us in our modern day, starting from something like Beowulf, okay? Okay, now, more importantly, why is Beowulf such an interesting cultural and historical piece to study? Because it is written, kind of like what we've been discussing in the previous videos, it's written in between two cultures. And the first culture that it kind of comes from, that it develops from as its root soil, is this one right here, the Old Norse and the Saxon paganism, which, as it says, is a polytheistic tradition, like we talked about in the last couple of videos, that emphasized a bleakness to human life, the struggle against inevitable and final death of all things, okay, with these images of fire, ice, darkness, and death. And one of the major motifs therein being mutual destruction, right? Two powerful beings collide, and we have a mutual destruction of both, giving us that kind of echo of Ragnarok, the tone of Ragnarok. So that's the setting of Beowulf. However, the interesting thing is that Beowulf is actually written, we're pretty certain, is written by Christian monks, by Christians who had gone to spread Christianity into the Saxon world, who stayed and lived there, who learned the Saxon tradition, and then were retelling it essentially, but with sort of a Christian, what would you say, worldview behind it. So what is the difference therefore? Early Christianity, of course, is monotheistic, emphasizes hope in the struggle against the evils of this world, leading ultimately to a new life of light and love, okay? Images of sacrifice, light versus darkness, and resurrection, of course, okay? So a very, very different world. Now, an interesting thing to note there is that when the Christians from the lower part of Europe spread into the Saxon world, into Scandinavia, into the Nordic regions, the religion is picked up almost immediately. They are extremely eager, in some sense, to adopt Christianity. It was not, in the vast majority of the time, guys, it was not spread through force and threat of violence. They didn't need to with Christianity. As we discussed back in the Christianity video, it is inherently a very attractive religion in the ancient world because of how hopeful it is and how much it appeals to people who are downtrodden, who are suffering, and who are, usually not paid much attention to. And even more so in this particular culture, who has this sort of a worldview, in this incredibly bleak, almost hopeless worldview. You come across them and you reveal to them, no, there's this whole truth that we know about Jesus and the resurrection and heaven and this loving God and all this kind of stuff. That's going to be extremely attractive to them, and it was. And so as a result, the author of Beowulf, as it says here, uses both of these traditions, both the Saxon and like the best of the Saxon that he likes, and also the best of Christianity. Though he himself is likely definitely a Christian and created something rather unique in its flavor, therefore. So it's a curious mix. It's where we have Christian ideals, Christian themes, but told through an Anglo-Saxon story. It's very, very unique, okay? Now, who is Beowulf? Well, he's a famous Geat who has a reputation preceding him before the story begins. And he's a monster slayer. Okay? He defeats monsters, he fights monsters, he does these feats of strength. His particular gift as a hero is his grip, his like arm strength, right? Never skips arm day. Every day is arm day for Beowulf. But this is not, interestingly, the result of divine lineage or magical tools. So Beowulf is just a man who is blessed, we can use that word, right? With divine strength. Not to the level of Hercules, right? But enough to where it's impressive to others. Okay. So he's a human, not a demigod, with this strength. Okay. He is, of course, like we said, most famous for defeating monsters. Several monsters are kind of under his belt by the time he appears in this story. He overcomes sea monsters, demons, and more. And the text of Beowulf is essentially about his conquering of three monsters that are plaguing, or that eventually will plague, the kingdom of a king called Hrothgar while he comes to visit him, essentially. Okay. The first monster, and we're going to read essentially just the passages that discuss Beowulf's conflict with these monsters. The first monster is this being called Grendel. He is essentially a demon, all right, or to use the Anglo-Saxon word, an orc. Okay. Now, all of my fantasy nerds will, of course, recognize the word orc, and that is, of course, where J.R.R. Tolkien gets his race of what are essentially demonic beings from, is from something like Beowulf. Okay. So he has dark skin, appears with to only roam at night, preying on the mead halls of the Nordic king. And he particularly is noteworthy or what is particularly noteworthy about Grendel is, number one, that he despises the sound. He is resentful of the sound of revelry and joy that comes from the mead hall. And additional to this is that he is a cannibal. Okay. And we didn't look at it in detail, but the Cyclops in the ancient in the story of Homer and the Odyssey was a Cyclops too. Polyphemus is a cannibal, rather. He's also a cannibal. So let's talk about that when we get into this. Why is cannibalism sort of this recurrent trait of evil, as we're going to see? Okay, so we'll get to the next monster in a minute, but let's pause and turn over to our text. If you're following along with the text that I usually give out in class, here it is. Just a couple of short answer questions or close reading questions that we'll do as we move along through this. But let's start with the passage on Grendel. As you can see, it's really pretty short. It's only like 2 pages long. So out of the marsh, from the foot of the misty hills and bogs, bearing God's hatred, Grendel came, hoping to kill anyone he could trap on his trip to the high Heorot, okay, the land that he's going to. So we have Grendel, notice, coming out of the marshland, coming out of the dark, cold wilderness into the place of warmth and security, right? Typical sort of monster behavior if we think of back to our symbols and back to our metaphors for life. Excuse me. Now, Grendel is, as the Anglo-Saxon will say, bare God ire. He's bearing God's wrath. Okay, why? Because he's a demon, because he's done something in the past. I don't know, but whatever it is that is going on with him, he's causing God's hatred. God has ire. It's a bad word. It's a bad translation. The term in the original Saxon was ire, God de ire. It's God's wrath, not God's hatred. Okay, so little poetic distinction there. Sorry. Now it says he moved quickly through the cloudy night, up from his swampland, sliding silently towards the gold shining hall. He had visited Hrothgar's home before, knew the way, but never before nor after that night found Heorot defended so firmly, his reception so harsh. Okay, so he is on his way there, but as we're going to see, he's going to have a not a very successful night. Okay, number 1 here. In the first 25 lines, underline at least 2 phrases that best characterize Grendel and summarize them. So we got 1, right? Bearing God's ire, coming from the marshes, right? He's visited here before. He journeyed, forever joyless, straight to the door, then snapped it open, tore its iron fasters with a touch, and rushed angrily over the threshold. He strode quickly across the inlaid floor, snarling and fierce. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, burning with a gruesome light. He stopped, seeing the hall crowded with sleeping warriors, stuffed with rows of young soldiers resting together. Okay, so we see that he is joyless, right? He's forever joyless. He's strong. He's able to break the door easily. Fierce, gleaming eyes in the darkness. Gruesome is their light, right? They're not beautiful, they're gruesome. And he's kind of watching the men as they're sleeping. So creepy sort of image here. Now, a couple pieces of characterization. Bearing God's wrath, joyless, all this kind of stuff. Right there, I think you see some of the Judeo-Christian thematic influence here. The synonymous concept of bearing God's ire and also being joyless, right? We know from our theology understanding of the excuse me of the religious texts that both Jews and Christians understand that God is the source of life and joy and light and all this kind of stuff. Well, Grendel, as you can see, comes from a place that's outside of this. There's something going on in his nature that makes him separate from that, and therefore he is joyless, right? And he resents those who have joy, like these people who were partying in the mead hall. So he comes in, and it says, his heart laughed. He relished the sight, intended to tear the life from these bodies by morning. The monster's mind was hot with the thought of food and the feasting his belly would soon know. But fate that night intended Grendel to gnaw the broken bones of his last human supper. Okay. So again, obvious foreshadowing, right? This is not going to be a good night for Grendel. He's hungry for human flesh and blood. He's about to gorge on it. Human eyes were watching his evil steps, waiting to see his swift, hard claws. Grendel snatched at the first geat he came to, ripped him apart, cut his body to bits with powerful jaws, drank the blood from his veins, and bolted him down hands and feet. Death at Grendel's great teeth came together, snapping life shut. Okay, so gross, absolutely gross. Now, if you go watch like I do in class, we watch the animated Beowulf movie. There's a great depiction of this, right? He grabs one of the geats and he just like bites off his head, like chews it, and you get this nice ASMR of the brains and the bones, all this kind of stuff, and the blood pouring out of his mouth. Okay, why so graphic? It's another one of those instances of when I tell parents, like, who say, I want my kid to only read the classics, nice, safe PG classics. I'm like, it's not always that safe, not always that PG. So why the gruesomeness? Why the appalling nature of what is essentially cannibalism here? Why do we have this? Why was it in Polyphemus? Why do we see it in Homer? All this kind of stuff. Well, a couple things. So number one, it's murder, right? Murder in and of itself. It's you're attacking someone who cannot fight back, who does not intend harm, at least at some point, right? They're asleep in this situation. In the Odyssey, they didn't intend harm. And you're killing them. Okay, so it's straight up murder. Bad, it's not a cultural relativism as much as people think. No, it's just bad, right? We don't like that. Okay, well, sure. Anything else about the way that we're killing these people? Like we said, it's murder, it's unarmed. It's also inside their home or a place where they are a guest, right? So in Polyphemus's case, he was eating Odysseus's soldiers inside his own home. So that was really bad, right? Like you're killing someone you're killing someone who are guests in your home. Here, yeah, it's not Grendel's home, but he's breaking into someone's home to kill them, right? This is particularly uh fearful for sure, right? We really have a paranoid fear about that, and rightly so. But it's particularly bad also because it's meant to be somewhere where they are safe. It's meant to be somewhere that he doesn't belong, right? He's a guest in that sense. He's forcing himself in there. He's killing other guests. That's deeply dishonorable. Okay, sure. All those pleasantries out of the way. How about the fact that he is eating people, right? So the cannibalism. Why is cannibalism seen as this monstrous thing throughout our cultures? Well, because there were and there are at this time cultures and tribes that absolutely did engage in cannibalism to greater and lesser degrees. The tribes and the civilizations in Central America at this time were practicing cannibalism. We didn't have any contact with them, of course. So this culture didn't have contact with them. But, just as an illustration, guys, is that, not everybody, in the world simply behaved by the standards that we understand today. No, not at all. We had cultures to the north as well, north of Europe, old, but they were there, that did engage in cannibalism at times, and it was a frightful thing. You have therefore this paranoia and this disgust develop in the human imagination for this behavior. Some people say, "Oh, it's not really cannibalism because it's a demon." The point is that it's a humanoid thing with personhood, with self-consciousness, devouring someone who also is humanoid with a consciousness, right, with a soul. So it's effectively cannibalism. Now, the other little detail here, and part of the reason why we get the description is the rawness of it, right? It's not, Grendel's not even cooking the meat, right? Polyphemus didn't cook Odysseus' men. Why is the raw meal seen as something monstrous? Because it is the practice of animals, right? Think back to the notions of civilization, of what is civilized, what is not, what is bestial. Beasts eat things raw, blood and all, bones and marrow and all. That's what Grendel's doing here, right? So he is separating himself in that sense from society, right? So typical characterization of a monster here. Sure, okay, he kills this geat, he eats the geat. Then he stepped to another still body, clutched at Beowulf with his claws, grasped at a strong-hearted, wakeful sleeper, and was instantly seized himself. Claws bent backwards as Beowulf leaped up once more. That shepherd of evil, guardian of crime, knew at once that nowhere on earth had he met a man whose hands were harder. His mind was flooded with fear, but nothing could take his talons and himself from that tight, hard grip. Okay, so there it is, right? Beowulf's true strength is his arm strength, his grip strength. So Grendel, goes for him, and then he immediately, like, you kind of got to imagine Beowulf like grabs his hand, bends his arm backwards, like, whoa, like that. Never felt anything that strong. Grendel's one thought was to run from Beowulf, flee back to the marsh, to his marsh, and hide there. This was different. This was a different Heorot than the hall that he had emptied. But Hygelac's follower remembered his final boast and, standing erect, stopped the monster's flight, hastened those claws in his fist till they cracked, clutched Grendel closer. Okay, so a couple things here. Grendel immediately wants to run. Now, is that a praise of Beowulf or a praise or a damnation of Grendel? Kind of a critique of Grendel. Does that mean that he's that much of a coward that he's not going to, stand and fight? He just kind of creeps on people when they're asleep? Maybe it's showing his cowardice. I think it also just highlights, and I think what the author is really highlighting here is the level of Beowulf's strength. Is that as soon as he, grabs Grendel's arm, Grendel immediately knows. He's like, I can't fight against whoever that is. So he runs away, and this phrase here, Hygelac's follower, that's of course referring to Beowulf, right? Because again, in classic poetry and epic poetry, we're never going to usually say Beowulf, Beowulf, Beowulf. We're going to say Hygelac's son, the hero of the Geats, the savior of all this kind of stuff. We're going to use different phrases for these people. So he breaks Grendel's hand, essentially. And then what? The infamous killer fought for his freedom, wanting no flesh but retreat, desiring nothing but escape. His claws had been caught. He was trapped. That trip to Heorot was a miserable journey for the writhing monster. High hall rang, its roof boards swayed. The Danes shook with terror. Down the aisles, the battle swept, angry and wild. Okay, so Beowulf has him in his hand, right? Like he's grabbed the hand. We can imagine Grendel is flailing around, is running around, screaming. Beowulf will not let him go, right? He's got him in that kind of vice grip. The sounds changed. The Danes started in new terror, cowering in their beds as the terrible scream of the Almighty's enemies sang in the darkness. Horrible shrieks of pain and defeat, the tears torn out of Grendel's taut throat. Hell's captive caught in the arms of that mighty protector of men, meant to hold the monster till its life leaped out, knowing the fiend was no use to anyone in Denmark. Okay, so Grendel, the Almighty's enemy, screams more and more and more. So we can kind of tell just by the sound of the screaming that something really bad is happening right now. This is awful, right? Grendel is just freaking out. It's like a dying animal here. It's like a trapped, terrified animal. All of Beowulf's band had jumped from their beds, ancestral swords raised and determined to protect their prince if they could. Their courage was great, but all wasted. They could hack at Grendel from every side, trying to open a path for his evil soul, but their points could not hurt him. The sharpest and hardest iron could not scratch at his skin. For that sin-stained demon had bewitched all men's weapons, laid spells that blunted every mortal man's blade. And yet his time had come. His days were over, his death near. Down to hell he would go, swept, groaning and helpless, to the waiting hands of still worse fiends. Okay, great imagery there. So we have an interesting little detail about Grendel is that he had essentially laid spells on himself or the weapons that touch him that blunt them so that he can't really be hurt, essentially, right? That giving us some instance of Grendel's power, right? He has magical abilities. And he's going to lose this, right? As we're going to see. He's going to lose, and he's going to be cast down into hell. So Beowulf's men are not able to really help at this point. And it's basically left to Beowulf to do the job. Excuse me. Now we discovered, once the afflictor of men, tormentor of their days, what it meant to feud with Almighty God. Grendel saw that his strength was deserting him, his claws bound fast, Hygelac's brave follower tearing at his hands. The monster's hatred rose higher, but his power had gone. He twisted in pain, and the bleeding sinews deep in his shoulders snapped. Muscle and bones split and broke. The battle was over. Beowulf had been granted new glory. Grendel escaped, but wounded as he could flee to his den, his miserable hole at the bottom of the marsh, only to die, to wait for the end of all his days. Okay, so a couple things here. Let's look at the questions. What did Beowulf do, first of all? Well, he ripped Grendel's arm off with his brute strength. I love it. That's so metal. Now, historically and culturally, what are the reasons why this act of Grendel is villainous, right? We discussed that. We talked about the notion of murder and cannibalism. What is his weapon here? How does this characterize him as a hero? What ancient heroes is he therefore similar to? I think he's obviously similar to Heracles, right? Someone who relies on his brute strength in part, right? Although here, I think you could probably praise Heracles a little bit more because, excuse me, because he is essentially a little more clever, or at least demonstrates a little more cleverness and strategy than Beowulf does. Now, Beowulf also could be seen as a little bit more brave, you could say, than Heracles, right? He's fighting this demon essentially in the dark, in a dark hallway. So yeah, a little bit more bravery there, but also the grip strength is his major weapon. Okay. What elements contribute to the mood here? How does this contribute to his heroism? Well, we just said that, right? There's a dark, just terrifying sort of mood that Beowulf is, an environment that Beowulf is basically staying in here. Right? He's in a dark hallway, in a dark, gathering room, surrounded by a bunch of sleeping people. Right? It's meant to be a place where you expect comfort. So I usually tell my students that this is like, you're terrified of the monster under your bed, and you face it. Right? You actually do grab it, but you have to face it in the dark. Right? So it is kind of spooky, and it demonstrates another level of his heroism. So he rips off Grendel's arm. Grendel goes fleeing back to the moors, right? Now, what happens next? A couple different things happen next. I'm not going to go through all the plot points of Beowulf. Again, we're more interested in just the monster combat for now. So he goes out to find the next kind of demon that's still going to be a plague on the land. And that, of course, is Grendel's mother, right? So there's an interesting little symbolic or metaphorical thing going on there that you can play with if you want to really interpret this a lot of different ways. Is that you have a problem that has come to your home, and you face it and you defeat it as it comes into your life. But there's going to be more. So you essentially have to go out and find the source of the monsters. You have to find the mother of monsters. You have to find whatever it is that is generating problems in your life. So if you're familiar with the hero's journey, what do you therefore need to do? You need to go out into chaos. You need to go out of your familiar comfort zone, and you need to go into the cave to discover whatever it is that is tormenting you, whatever it is that is bringing about these monsters. And what is it here? It is Grendel's mother, described as a demoness who gave birth to Grendel. She dwells in dark waters. and seeks vengeance for her son's death. Okay, we could analyze this to death, right? She's a figure, the mother of demons that dwells in dark waters under the earth, right? Very primordial sort of demon in that sense. Couple good depictions of her. Not a lot of artwork of Grendel's mom out there. The movie depicts her as a succubus, right? As a demoness that is a temptress, and that kind of exploits Beowulf's flaws. Now, we're going to reference back to that in a minute because a lot of Beowulf experts, rightly and wrongly, both hate on the movie for its changes, as we'll see. But the movie still does have some good points here thematically, as you might catch. So Grendel's mom. Let's look at this. This is actually, I think, a much shorter passage, right? We only have the last bit of the battle here. So for the first question, it's going to ask: describe the battle between Bendel and Grendel's mother. Bendel and Beowulf, Grendel's mother and Beowulf, and then tell me who has the advantage and has disadvantages here. So let's take a look. He goes down into the cave, right? Finds her underneath the water. And this is what happens. A brilliant light burned all around him, the lake itself like a fiery flame. Then he saw the mighty water witch and swung his sword, his ring-marked blade straight at her head. The iron sang its fierce song, sang Beowulf's strength, but her guest discovered that no sword could slice her evil skin, that hunting could not hurt her. Sorry, her skin, that hunting could not hurt her, was useless now when he needed it. Okay, so interesting here. His sword hunting, when he tries to kill Grendel's mom, doesn't work. For whatever reason, we can probably assume that it's something similar to what happened with Grendel, where the swords wouldn't hurt him because of his spells or whatever. You might say it's because she's stronger, right? She just has inherently more durability than this, but it doesn't work. So what happens? They wrestled. She ripped and tore and clawed at him, bit holes in his helmet, and that too failed him. For the first time in years of being worn to war, it would earn no glory. It was the last time anyone would wear it, but Beowulf longed only for fame, leaped back into battle. Leaped back into battle. He tossed his sword aside, angry. The steel-edged blade lay there. He dropped it. If weapons were useless, he'd use his hands, the strength in his fingers. So fame comes to the men who mean to win it and care about nothing else. He raised his arms and seized her by the shoulder. Anger doubled his strength. He threw her to the floor. Okay, so as you would expect, he ditches the sword and he turns to his strength. Now we have some characterization here. Beowulf is motivated by the desire for fame, right? He's doing this in part to, yes, help the people of Hrothgar's kingdom. But fundamentally, he is motivated by fame, right? He sought out the problem in Hrothgar's kingdom because he was like, oh, I can gain more reputation for killing Grendel, and now we have Grendel's mom. I'll do the same thing with her. So that's kind of what he's going for, which is a very classic pagan, Anglo-Saxon, old world motive. We want fame, we want glory for our deeds. Now, but she rose at once and repaid him with her clutching claws, wildly tearing at him. He was weary, that beast and strongest of soldier. His feet stumbled, and in an instant she had him down, held helpless. Okay, now that's interesting because we were told that his strength was enough to conquer Grendel. His strength is doubled here because he is so angry, and yet she is able to overpower him. So that ain't good. This is really not good. So she's got him pinned. Okay. Squatting with her weight on his stomach, she drew a dagger brown with dried blood and prepared to avenge her only son. So now she's got a weapon and she's going to stab it down on him. But he was stretched on his back, and her stabbing blade was blunted by the woven mail shirt he wore on his chest. Lucky, right? Was able to kind of protect him a little bit. The hammered links held, the point could not touch him. He'd have traveled to the bottom of the earth, Ecgtheow's son, and died there if that shining woven metal had not helped. And holy God, who sent him victory, gave judgment for truth and right. Ruler of the heavens, once Beowulf was back on his feet and fighting, then he saw hanging on the wall. So pause there real quick. Beowulf fails, or Grendel's mother fails to kill him. And we have a mention here, which, if you read the full poem, is mentioned many times, that God, holy God, who sent him victory, gave judgment for truth and right, the ruler of heavens, once Beowulf is back on his feet and fighting. God determines Beowulf will win this. Beowulf will have victory. Okay. Then he saw, that as Beowulf saw, hanging on the wall, a heavy sword hammered by giants, strong and blessed with their magic, the best of all weapons, but so massive that no ordinary man could lift its carved and decorated length. He drew it from its scabbard, broke the chain on its hilt, and then, savage now, angry with and desperate, lifted it high over his head and struck with all his strength he had left, caught her in the neck and cut it through, broke bones and all. Her body fell to the floor lifeless. The sword was wet with her blood, and Beowulf rejoiced at the sight. Okay. So great scene here. He's struggling to beat this demoness, and he, gets out from under her, and he's like, I don't know how the heck I'm going to win this. I don't know what I'm going to do. Oh my God. And he sees there on the wall, there is a sword, a giant sword. He's like, oh, cool. Grabs it, and then he, like, in one motion, just cuts her head off. So, couple questions. In terms of advantages and disadvantages here, I usually do like the MMA breakdown with my students. So you got Beowulf and you got Grendel's mother. Who's got the home field advantage? Grendel's mom. So Grendel's mom's got one advantage there. Beowulf's got his strength and his skill. Cool. Grendel's mother has more strength. Okay, so we could add one more in for the strength and skill of Beowulf. Sure. Okay, what else? Grendel's mother has the protection against weapons. Okay. So if you look at that, Beowulf's gonna lose, right? Just it doesn't seem like he can really win this. And then for this next question, according to the text, who is responsible for Beowulf's victory here? I think the narration, and it's not being entirely clear, depending on the translation, some will say God deemed or granted his victory. Some will translate that as God has ordered his victory. Okay, so that means that God is responsible for the victory here? How? Because Beowulf killed her. Well, he was going to lose, but he used someone else's weapon. Okay, so I guess it's also whoever owned that weapon's fault, or that's the reason that he won. Do you see kind of what, and you got to think sort of theologically here, what the author is doing? It's God who brought this about. Through what? I didn't see God appear and turn her into a fish and kind of smite her dead and all this kind of stuff. I didn't see God grant Beowulf miraculous strength. But we saw that Beowulf just so happens to find a perfect weapon to kill her in his moments of need. Well, how did that get there? Well, I would assume, she took up this home, or she collected it at some point, or it found its way there by chance or by victory. That's the point there. It is not by chance that sword is there. Oh, well, it's okay. It's not chance. It's because she brought it there and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, okay. It's what's called God's providence. It's God's ordering of history. So at some point, 300, 3,000, whatever years ago, however old, the beings in this story are, Grendel's mother inhabited this place, and either by her actions or by the happenings of fate at the time, of history at the time, that sword was left there, so that in years or ages to come, when finally someone would be able to get down there and battle her, they would have the weapon that they needed. That is what we mean by God's providence. Okay, so in this sense, we have now Beowulf receiving divine help to defeat Grendel's mother. How does this demonstrate the shift in values from the first battle? Okay, first battle, Beowulf goes out for glory. Yes. He wins it. he defeats Grendel entirely with his bare hands. So if you want, that fight is like a classic pagan heroism fight, right? You have two great forces, they clash, and one is victorious through the bruteness of his own strength and power, right? Classical sort of hero story right there, our classical sort of hero structure right there. Here, however, where does that responsibility shift? It's to God. It is miraculous. It is the ordering of providence that bring about the hero's victory. It is not entirely because of the hero. It's not entirely because of God. It's both working together now. So that's a pretty big shift. Now we know of values essentially because that would have never happened in the ancient world. That would not have been a thing where we're like, oh, it was the divine, beings that brought about my victory, essentially. Now, at some points it kind of is, right? In Homer's stories or in the stories of conflicts in Greek myths. But fundamentally, you look at Odysseus, you look at Achilles and Heracles. It's 90% it's them, right? They get the help from gods here and there, and the guidance from the gods here and there, but it's fundamentally, their actions that carry them through. Now, here, however, in this culture, it's like, no, at the very last, you've done everything that you can, and you are no match for whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And thus, you need to rely on God's grace, on God's love, on God's providence, all this kind of stuff to bring victory to you. Excuse me. So, we see there that shift from the very pagan Anglo-Saxon culture moving more and more into that kind of more Christian, that Judeo-Christian value. Okay, now the last creature. So Beowulf, in between monsters, Beowulf becomes king. All right, he's granted kingship. He has a wife. He's wealthy. Whole shebang. Now, interesting little happening here. Speaking of providence, a villager, a thief, wandering around the countryside of Beowulf's kingdom, finds a barrow, which is where we like a cave where we would bury people. In this barrow is a hoard of treasure, a hoard of gold, and they steal a cup, a golden cup, and leave with it. And this unknowingly to him, awakens the creature that was dwelling in that hole over that gold, which was a dragon. Okay. Here again, we have the fire-breathing serpent hoarding over gold like we saw in Sigurd. It comes out of the earth and it wreaks destruction and havoc all over the countryside and threatens to burn Beowulf's kingdom and the people within it to the ground. So Beowulf now has to go out and stop this creature. Okay. So again, we have about a page and a half here. Let's see what's going on here. Beowulf comes out. Sad at heart, addressing his companions, Wiglaf spoke wise and fluent words. Wiglaf is Beowulf's kind of closest companion and friend. I remember that time when the mead was flowing, how we pledged loyalty to our Lord in the hall, promised our ring giver we would be worth our price. Make good the gift of the war gear, those swords and helmets, as when his need required it. He picked us out from the army deliberately, honored us and judged us fit for this action, made me these lavish gifts, and all because he considered us the best of his arms-bearing thanes. Now, although he wanted this challenge to be the one he'd face by himself alone, the shepherd of our land, a man unequaled in the quest for glory, and a name for daring. Now the day has come when this Lord we serve needs sound men to give him their support. Let us go to him, help our leader through the hot flame and the dread of the fire. As God is my witness, I would rather my body be robed in the same burning blaze as my gold giver's body than go back home bearing arms That is unthinkable unless we have first slain the foe and defeated the life of the prince of the weather, slain the foe and defended the life of the prince and the weather geese. I well know that things he has done. I well know that things he has done for us deserve better. Should he alone be left exposed to fall in battle, we must bond together, shield and helmet, mail shirt, and sword. Okay, so a couple things here. Wiglaf points out, time to go fight for Beowulf. Okay, and now that's immediately a different here. Who's accompanying Beowulf in this battle? Well, he has Wiglaf and some of his best thanes with him this time. He wanted to go alone. They didn't allow him to. So again, transition. First battle, we have him alone with Grendel. Then we have him with God's help, defeating the mother of Grendel. Now, in facing the dragon, he has his men as well. So if you want, you can kind of see the diluting, if you want to use that word, the kind of spreading around, spreading out of glory here. First, it's only me, it's my glory. Then it's my glory thanks to God. Now it's the glory of me and my friends, my companions around me. Okay. So, for number two, how is Beowulf's role in this battle being characterized differently than the previous two? Well, Wiglaf referred to him as the shepherd of this land. And he's going out to defeat a dragon that is threatening him and his people. I think the role here is no longer a glory seeker or a simple kind of fame seeker. He is primarily acting as a shepherd, as someone who sees a threat to his flock or through his people and is going out to face it, right? So he's a defender now. He's a defender surrounded by his friends. So interesting, again, change in values, change in the roles here. How does this metaphor, that is of the shepherd, right, demonstrate the Christian influence on the text? It very clearly is using Christian, Judeo-Christian imagery. A shepherd and a sheep. Not a very prominent image in the Nordic culture, the Nordic regions, okay? It absolutely is in the Judeo-Christian religion. And so associating Beowulf with those things transfers all of the values of that sort of imagery, that sort of metaphor figure from the Christian tradition, into into this Anglo-Saxon character. Okay, so here we go. Bond together. Then he waded the dangerous reek and went under arms to his lord, saying only, "Go on, dear Beowulf, do everything you said you would when you were still young, and vowed you would never let your name and fame be dimmed while you lived. Your deeds are famous, so stay resolute, my lord. Defend your life now with the whole of your strength. I shall stand with you." Okay, so it's going out to face the dragon. After those words, a wildness rose in the dragon again and drove it to attack, heaving up fire, hunting for enemies. The humans it loathed. Flames lapped the shield, charred it to the bone. Charred it to the boss and the body armor. Interesting. On the young warrior, on the young warrior was useless to him. And the body armor on the young warrior was useless to him. But Wiglaf did well under the wide rim. Beowulf shared with him once his own shattered in sparks and ashes. Inspired again by the thought of glory, the war king threw his whole strength behind a sword stroke and connected with the skull, and it's the skull of the dragon. And his sword, Naegling, snapped. Beowulf's ancient iron gray sword failed him in the fight. It was never his fortune to be helped in combat by the cutting edge of weapons made of iron. When he yielded a sword, no matter how bloodied and hard-edged the blade in his hand was too strong, and the stroke he dealt, I have heard, would ruin it. He would reap no advantage. Okay. So, a couple things. What makes him, that is this, oh, we missed the first one, sorry. What symbolic element is the dragon associated with? Obviously, it's fire. It's associated with fire and therefore death and destruction and pain. Okay. And that's, of course, the answer down here. So the dragon is literally dangerous because it could literally kill you and burn you, but it's also just demonstrated, or it's a metaphor for the mere presence of destruction and death and erosion that is now facing Beowulf and his people. Okay. Ironically, what has put Beowulf at a disadvantage here, right? So when Beowulf grabs his sword and swings it down on to the dragon, what happens? It shatters, right? The stroke that he deals is too strong because of his grip strength, because of his arm strength, that it's gonna just break the sword, right? That's pretty awesome. But it's just not good for him, right? So what happens? He yields the sword. He could reap no advantage. Then the Thane, sorry. Then the bane of that people, the fire-breathing dragon, was mad to attack for a third time. When a chance came, he caught the hero in a rush of flame and clamped sharp fangs into his neck. Beowulf's body ran wet with his lifeblood. It came welling out. Next thing, they say, the noble son of Weohstan saw the king in danger at his side and displayed his inborn bravery and strength. He left the head alone, but his fighting hand was burned when he came to his kinsman's aid. He lunged at the enemy lower down, so that his decorated sword sank into its belly and the flames grew weaker. Once again, the king gathered his strength and drew a stabbing knife he carried on his belt, sharpened for battle. He struck it deep in the dragon's flank. Beowulf dealt it a deadly wound. They had killed the enemy. Courage quelled his life. That pair of kinsmen's partners in nobility had destroyed the foe. So every man should act, but be at hand when needed. But now for the king, this would be the last of many labors and triumphs in the world. Okay. So pretty awesome. You have Beowulf swinging the sword down, it breaks, and the dragon in response clamps around Beowulf's throat. So he bites him in the throat. And it's holding him there, right? And so while it's doing that, Leolaf grabs his sword and stabs the dragon under kind of his belly, right? Again, referencing a little bit to Sigurd. Beowulf, while that's being done, while the neck is still grabbed here, he grabs a knife, and he stabs it into the flank of the dragon, probably in his head or in his neck or something like that. And the dragon dies. But of course, as as the narration is foreshadowing, that Beowulf is also going to die. And it's not really from blood loss, but actually from the venom of the dragon. Okay. How could the end of this battle connect to the events of Norse mythology? Most people will see it right away. It's that recurring motif of mutual destruction, right? Two foes fighting each other, both die. Okay. It's a little bit dim. It's a little bit grim. It's like weapons breaking, things not working, and both people dying together, essentially. It's similar, if you want to draw an immediate connection, it's kind of similar to Thor and Jormungandr, possibly. Now, to conclude, let's look at the question here. Explain how the historical introduction of Christianity has affected the Norse legend of Beowulf. Well, you can see it most clearly, I think, in the shift of values through this progression. You have a hero behaving and speaking and being written very much in the vein of the classic pagan heroes, where it is an exaltation of their own strength and fame. That's what they're seeking. Then we have a progression of that same character who is not able to overcome a challenge without divine intervention, without divine providence. Okay. So shifting the glory away from Beowulf slightly and onto God here. That's one. Then we have Beowulf not acting in isolation, but acting with companions. So friends, relationships are a major player here. We additionally have him not being motivated by personal glory and fame, but for the protection of his country. thereby giving him a different kind of glory, not just glory because of how great how like, profound you are in your deeds, but a glory at a moral level because you have chosen to step out into danger and potentially lose your life in defense of your people. So that kind of glory, very, very Christian idea, right? And he even sacrifices himself for his people. So if you're looking at this through that Christian perspective, you see the obvious parallel to a Christ-like figure there. Now, that shift's pretty clear. We still have some of the similar details and values of the Anglo-Saxon and the Christian worldview. So if you wanted to, if we were in class again, I would draw sort of a Venn diagram. We have the Norse pagan and the Christian cultures, values and ideals and motifs. They do overlap. Okay, there is an overlap there. Where's the overlap? I think it's very clearly in something like the conclusion here. Beowulf dies. He is going to die because he is a man. He cannot help from dying because he is a man struggling in this fallen world, in this world of tragedy, of death and sickness and all this kind of stuff. However, he dies well. He does not die as an evil being. He does not die cowering. He does not die through kind of what seemingly random tragedy. And he does not die simply grasping at his own glory. He actually dies in defense of others, right? So there's nobility, and there is, to use the religious term, there's sanctity, there's sanctifyingness. There is a sanctifying nature to his death. So that's a really clear point where they overlap, right? And there's that sensation of, you could kill Grendel, you could kill the mom with help, but there's going to be something that you cannot defeat. And that is the dragon, that is death itself. It's essentially what the dragon symbolizes here, is death. You cannot truly conquer death. I think, however, in the way that the kingdom lives on and lives on in greater peace through Beowulf's sacrifice, that is sort of a little bit of a repudiation of that really dim, dark mood that we have in Ragnarok, right? If this were Ragnarok, the dragon would kill everybody, right? And everyone would die, and then the dragon would die, and then everything would be ashes. That's not what happens. The dragon is slain through the selfless sacrifice and work of Beowulf and his companions that help him. And then they're able to live in peace afterwards. Okay. And Beowulf essentially earns a different kind of glory, maybe from the author's perspective, true glory. Okay. So that's a very, very clear way in which the Christian worldview is infusing itself into this particular work. Even as you're reading it, it might sound still more like a Norse work, and it does. So if you watch the movie, for example, if you read this, it still feels the tone, the flavor, the mood still feels very Anglo-Saxon, very Norse. And yet, if you look a little bit deeper, you do see, oh no, there's not pure Nordic things here. This isn't Sigurd, right? This is much more of a Christian sort of hero. Now, interestingly, if you go, as a side note, if you go watch the movie, that's even more present because the struggle in the movie is against Beowulf's lust, right? He himself has a flaw, has a hamartia. So it's essentially a tragedy from his own moral failings. So interestingly, the movie does still convey that kind of duality or that kind of dual relationship between the pagan and the Christian. But it actually uses an even more prevalent Christian idea, which is the idea of our own inherent sin and our fallenness and our susceptibility to sin and temptation, to tell its story, essentially, where Grendel's mother is not a demon simply to be overcome through strength, but she's actually a succubus that needs to be overcome through righteousness, through the resistance of temptation and temperance, right? Which he's not. And then Beowulf has to sort of redeem himself after he has succumbed to her temptations, right? So it still actually is a very Christian story, put within a Saxon framework, although, again, changed a little bit, right? So yeah, very interesting text, Beowulf. Now, we're not going to do the review or the discussion of Tolkien and all this kind of stuff because that's more for my fantasy class. So that's Beowulf. Now we're officially kind of done with our brief, very, very brief look at the Nordic culture and the Nordic stories. And the transition of Beowulf and the discussion of Beowulf is going to be really, really helpful for our next discussion, which is going to be in the medieval unit, where we discuss the stories of King Arthur and his knights. And we see very clearly how that Christian influence has really sort of begun to dominate, in some sense, the narrative structure, the narrative patterns of Europe. And I will see you, look forward to that. And I will see you in the next video when we start to cover King Arthur and his knights. Bye.